It was just after 3 in the morning on August 25th, 1892, when flames ripped through the Vanderbilt mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. Not the grand stonebreakers we know today, but its predecessor, a vast wooden structure, lavish and vulnerable, perched along the cliffs of the Atlantic coast. The fire began in the basement, likely due to faulty electrical wiring, a new and unpredictable technology at the time. Electricity had not yet been tamed by modern standards. It sparked without warning, overloaded systems, and turned luxurious homes into tinderboxes. By the time the smoke billowed up into the servant quarters, there was no time left. 3 staff members, asleep in cramped rooms, were overcome by fire and smoke. Mary Murphy, just 28 years old, Catherine Connolly, 35, Thomas Lynch, 42, all Irish immigrants, all gone before help could reach them, outside, in the chill of the Newport night. Cornelius Vanderbilt stood in his nightclothes with his wife and children, watching their summer estate burn to the ground, powerless to stop it. And what does that tragedy have to do with Biltmore, America's largest private home? Everything. Because from that moment forward, George Vanderbilt, Cornelius's younger brother, swore that when he built his house, it would never burn. It would defy disaster. It would be built to endure. But at what cost? That's the story you're about to hear. Not the polished tour guide version, but the hidden history of sacrifice, loss, and the steep price of preservation. Before we uncover the full truth behind Biltmore, take a moment to support this investigation. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this, ones they don't tell on the official tours. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you find this mystery as compelling as we do, share this video with someone who believes history should include everything, not just the fairy tale. Let's see how many people truly understand what the title means: the hidden cost of Biltmore. George Vanderbilt was not like the rest of his family. Bookish, soft-spoken, a lover of literature and philosophy. He'd always been the quiet one. But in that silence stirred grand dreams. He had already begun envisioning his own estate, a home that would not only reflect culture and refinement, but endure through time. The Newport fire became a turning point. George watched as his brother's home collapsed in ash, and he vowed his home would not be vulnerable to the same fate. It would be a fortress of art and intellect, built not just for beauty but for permanence. It would not burn. It could not burn. By 1888, George had chosen the mountains of western North Carolina as the location for his retreat. Rolling hills blanketed in mist, forests untouched by the modern world, at least in his eyes. He called it a wilderness, but he knew better. He wanted a castle of peace and introspection. Yet the fire in Newport was always with him. When he hired architect Richard Morris Hunt, one of his first requirements was fireproofing. No wooden frame, no gas lines running unchecked, no old-fashioned chimneys in every room. Steel framing, limestone walls, redundant water systems. He even demanded an internal fire department, with water towers and hoses placed strategically throughout the estate. These weren't decorative choices. They were answers to the screams no one heard on that August night in Newport. George spared no expense. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and transported across multiple states. Steel beams, rare in residential buildings at the time, formed the skeleton of the house. Sprinkler systems, practically unheard of in a private home, were installed with industrial precision. In his obsessive pursuit of safety, George turned Biltmore into a prototype of modern residential construction. Every design, every material, every reinforcement was chosen not only for elegance, but for resistance. He wasn't building a home. He was constructing a bulwark against fate. What's most haunting is that Biltmore's resilience, its fireproof strength, was bought not merely with dollars, but with the lives of Mary, Catherine, and Thomas. Their deaths were not in vain, but they were unpaid debts in the ledger of history. There are no plaques at Biltmore that bear their names, no velvet-roped corners acknowledging that without that fire, and without those deaths, George might have built a very different kind of house. Instead, their sacrifice became a silent cornerstone of Biltmore's foundation. Their absence shaped its every beam and corridor. The irony is cruel. A tragedy in one Vanderbilt home preserved life in another. Just years later, George's obsession with safety didn't end with fireproofing. He insisted on state-of-the-art heating systems to avoid open flames. He approved electric lighting over gas, despite its infancy and the risks it still posed, because he believed in controlling danger. He built corridors and servants' passages that allowed for evacuation. He placed exits strategically throughout the home. The estate was a sanctuary by design, not just from the elements, but from human error and technological threat. These precautions were revolutionary for their time. In fact, some safety innovations at Biltmore predated code requirements by decades. But for all his foresight, George never publicly mentioned the Newport fire or the 3 servants whose deaths set him on this path. Perhaps it was too painful. Perhaps it was too personal. Or perhaps, as with many Gilded Age elites, acknowledging the cost too directly would require acknowledging a world of inequality he preferred to intellectualize rather than confront. Still, the reality remains. Biltmore, the grandest private residence in American history, owes its very structure to a fire no one in Asheville ever saw. It was born from smoke, forged from grief. The contrast is chilling. As you walk today through the grand halls of Biltmore, admiring the sweeping staircase or the 70-foot ceilings of the banquet hall, you're stepping through spaces built from caution, fear, and hard-won lessons. The opulence masks a funeral pyre. Tour guides may speak of innovation and vision, but they rarely mention the quiet funeral 3 Irish families held in 1892, nor the ripple effect their loss had across generations. The irony is almost too perfect. A fire that destroyed a home became the blueprint for building an unburnable dream. George Vanderbilt fulfilled his promise to build a home that fire could not destroy. But what he could never do was rebuild the lives that flame had already taken. Their loss was permanent, though their legacy is hidden in every inch of stone and steel. The fairy tale of Biltmore starts with a nightmare, and it is only by facing that nightmare honestly that we can understand what this masterpiece truly cost. Not just in dollars or ambition, but in human life, forever unspoken, forever embedded in the walls that never burned. When George Vanderbilt first rode through the misty valleys of western North Carolina in the late 1880s, he saw what many wealthy men of his class saw in rural America: opportunity disguised as wilderness. To his romantic sensibilities, the rolling hills were poetic, unspoiled. He imagined this untouched land as the perfect canvas for his dream, a French chateau among Appalachian peaks. But what George perceived as pristine nature was, in reality, already home to over 1,000 families. He wasn't riding through vacant forest land. He was passing through the lives of farmers, freedmen, craftsmen, widows, and children. many of whom had lived there for generations. Some of these families were the descendants of enslaved people, recently emancipated and given, or squatting on, tiny tracts of worn-out land. Others were white Appalachian homesteaders, fiercely independent but economically fragile. They had cleared the forests by hand, built their homes from timber, and scraped out a living on soil already exhausted from decades of poor farming practices and aggressive logging. Though they lived without title deeds or formal claims, they had churches, schools, and graveyards. They had rooted themselves in the land in ways far deeper than a ledger or legal document could reflect. George Vanderbilt, however, did not come to share space. He came to own it. Through agents and intermediaries, he began acquiring land in secret, small plots at first, then larger swaths. Some of the deals were straightforward. A few landowners, tired of poverty, saw Vanderbilt's money as a chance to start over elsewhere. But many sales were made under subtle coercion. A family might refuse, only to find that their neighbors had already sold, surrounding them with Vanderbilt property. Roads once public became private. Water sources were fenced off. Livelihoods were choked not by force, but by attrition. You could resist a while, but eventually, the mountain itself would close around you. By the time George had amassed over 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, entire communities had vanished. Churches stood empty, their congregations scattered. Schools shut down for lack of students. Small family cemeteries, once lovingly tended, became overgrown. Though George's representatives often promised families they could still visit the graves of their ancestors, the reality of changing roads and growing forests made such pilgrimages rare. Many of these cemeteries, their stones too modest to stand the test of time, were simply lost, forgotten beneath the towering trees George would later claim as his conservation triumph. To George's credit, his vision for the land wasn't purely extractive. He saw the deforested slopes and muddy streams and wanted to heal them. The environmental damage left by the lumber industry and poor farming was significant. Soil erosion was rampant. Wildlife habitats had been destroyed. In partnership with Gifford Pinchot and later Carl Schenck, George created one of the first managed forests in America, a prototype for sustainable land stewardship. Trees were replanted, streams were cleared, erosion was controlled. These efforts eventually led to the creation of Pisgah National Forest, when George sold 86,000 acres to the federal government. Environmental historians rightly view this as a pioneering moment in American conservation. But conservation is not absolution. Restoring the land does not erase the people displaced to make that restoration possible. The mountain wasn't empty, it was emptied. The families who once lived there were not the cause of the environmental destruction. That damage had been done by industrial logging firms decades before. The locals were simply surviving in the aftermath. George's intervention may have healed the land, but it did so by uprooting the humans who had managed to cling to it, despite poverty and hardship. Ethical intentions don't cancel the consequences. In a particularly bitter twist, some of the very people displaced by Vanderbilt's acquisitions ended up working for the construction of Biltmore itself. Men who had once hunted or farmed the land were now paid to build a palace atop it. Their wives took work as maids, their sons as laborers. The wages, though competitive for the region, were a fraction of what was paid to European craftsmen imported for their expertise. An Italian stonecutter could earn several dollars a day. A local worker might make a third of that. And while George offered decent worker housing in the form of Brick Village, It was still a village built to serve the estate that replaced the homes of its new residents. Some families took the money from the land sales and started new lives, opening shops in Asheville, buying farmland in neighboring counties, or even joining the wave of southern migration to industrial cities in the north. Others, particularly the elderly and the infirm, faded into obscurity. Oral histories from the region tell of displaced elders who refused to leave the land where their ancestors were buried, staying until the forest swallowed them whole. These stories are not recorded in the estate's glossy visitor brochures. They remain in the margins of history, passed down by descendants who remember the trauma, even if they've never walked Biltmore's gilded halls. George Vanderbilt likely never saw himself as a man who displaced the poor. He envisioned himself as a steward of the land, a builder of beauty, a patron of science, and in many ways, he was. But good intentions do not eliminate harm. A checkbook is not consent. The removal was legal, and by Gilded Age standards, even humane. But it was still removal. What makes the story of Biltmore's land so complicated and so American is the simultaneous truth of two narratives. One, a tale of visionary reforestation and landscape renewal. The other, a quieter story of lost homes, lost communities, and a kind of progress that required clearing the land not just of trees, but of people. Today, tourists stroll through Biltmore's gardens and marvel at the restored forests beyond. They gaze at the Blue Ridge horizon and hear stories of conservation brilliance. But few realize they are walking trails that once connected neighbors, that the dirt beneath their feet once held cabins and cornfields and graves. There are no signs in the woods that say a family lived here, but they did. Their ghosts are in the soil, their memories in the wind. If George Vanderbilt built paradise in North Carolina, he built it on land that had to be emptied first. And that price, like so many hidden costs in Biltmore's history, remains unspoken in the tours and brochures. But it is there, quietly shaping the legacy of the largest home in America. When George Vanderbilt approached Richard Morris Hunt with a proposal to build a French Renaissance chateau deep in the wilderness of North Carolina, the architect's initial answer was blunt and immediate. No. Hunt, by then the preeminent architect in America, had designed everything from the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty to the palatial summer cottages of Newport's elite. His portfolio glistened with European grandeur translated into American stone. But this was lunacy. George wasn't just asking for another mansion. He was asking for a miracle in a place where even the train tracks didn't yet reach. He wanted a palace on a mountaintop, bigger than anything America had seen, surrounded by nothing but forest, fog, and impossibility. George, as always, was undeterred. He didn't just want luxury. He wanted permanence. The house, he told Hunt, would be a retreat from the city, from society, from the vulgarities of the industrial world. It would be a place of beauty, literature, art, and quiet. He envisioned turrets rising above tree lines, hallways lit by electricity, heated by steam, a private world constructed in the image of the Loire Valley castles he'd fallen in love with during his travels in France. To him, the house wasn't extravagant. It was necessary. A cathedral to ideals that the Gilded Age was fast forgetting. He would spare no expense. The land was already his. The dream was ready. Now he needed someone mad enough to build it. Hunt eventually said yes, but only after laying out conditions that reflected just how insane the project really was. First, George would not interfere with the design process. Hunt would take inspiration from French chateaux, but adapt them for the American climate, American materials, and American labor. Second, George would not complain about cost. If perfection required shipping limestone from Indiana or importing carved ceilings from Europe, he would pay. Third, Hunt would select the contractors, the craftsmen, the engineers. No shortcuts, no compromises. This would be built properly, or not at all. George agreed to everything. He was a perfectionist, and Hunt was the only man who might deliver what he envisioned. The construction of Biltmore was unlike anything America had ever seen. Materials had to be moved over rough terrain in a region with minimal infrastructure. Hunt designed an entire railway spur just to connect the site with supply lines. He oversaw the transportation of tens of thousands of tons of limestone, steel, timber, and decorative features. The limestone alone came from Indiana quarries, each block numbered, mapped, and shipped with military precision. At the site, Italian stonecutters assembled them piece by piece under Hunt's watchful eye. From a distance, the house began to rise like a ghost out of the hills. First skeletal steel, then skin of stone, then decorative flourish. Hunt had to reconcile two architectural languages. On the outside, Biltmore was a classic French chateau. Spires, steep roofs, intricate stone carvings. But underneath, it was a marvel of modern engineering. Its steel frame was skyscraper technology repurposed for a mansion. That frame allowed for the immense open spaces inside. The banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling, the soaring library, the wide staircases. It also made the house fire-resistant, fulfilling George's vow after the Newport fire. Few residences of the time used such advanced methods. Biltmore didn't just look old. It hid its modern bones beneath layers of antique beauty. Inside, Hunt continued his balancing act. George wanted medieval romance, but he also wanted comfort. So Hunt built secret behind-the-walls corridors for the staff to move unseen. He installed elevators, dumbwaiters, electric bells, an intercom system, indoor plumbing, and even central heating powered by a sprawling underground boiler room. The kitchens had mechanical refrigeration systems. The bathrooms had hot and cold water, and the electrical wiring was so advanced that the estate had its own power plant. Biltmore was both castle and machine, a Renaissance fantasy wired into the modern world. Tensions between Hunt and George simmered throughout the process. George had a scholar's eye for detail and a patron's obsession with control. He would review blueprints at night and send detailed notes to Hunt in the morning. Sometimes the notes were aesthetic. Make the stonework on this turret more ornate. Other times they bordered on obsession. Reconsider the angle of light in the west-facing hall after 4 o'clock. Hunt, no less exacting, often overruled George or found diplomatic ways to redirect his client's whims. It was an uneasy collaboration, but a productive one. Perfection was the shared goal, even if the path to it was littered with disagreements and delays. As the years dragged on, the project ballooned in complexity and cost. What Hunt had warned would be expensive quickly became astronomically so. Worker housing had to be constructed. Supplies took weeks to arrive. Weather slowed progress. Specialized craftsmen from Europe had to be courted, shipped over, and settled into a region many of them had never heard of. Italian masons, French plasterers, German ironworkers, English woodcarvers. They arrived in waves to contribute their art to a house that was both homage and experiment. At peak, over 1,000 workers moved across the grounds, a temporary society built in service of one man's vision. Hunt would not live to see his masterpiece completed. In 1895, just months before the official opening, he died in New York at the age of 58. His son, Richard Howland Hunt, took over the final phase of the project. Working from his father's meticulous plans, the loss devastated George, who credited Hunt with translating his dreams into stone. For George, Biltmore was more than a house. It was an inheritance of artistry, labor, and friendship. And for Hunt, it was the culmination of decades spent bringing old-world grandeur into a new, restless country. The final cost of construction soared beyond $6 million, an astronomical sum for the time, equivalent to nearly $200 million today. George paid it without complaint, but Hunt's final warning echoed. Building it was only the beginning. Maintaining it would be the real burden. In pursuit of perfection, George had created something the world had never seen. But in doing so, he also built a legacy that would demand constant upkeep, endless funds, and generations of sacrifice. The dream had become real, but reality, as always, came with a price. The house still stands, its spires piercing the sky above Asheville, its limestone walls weathered but immovable, every arch, every balustrade, every carved panel whispers of the argument between dreamer and builder, the tension between vision and execution. Hunt gave George a castle, but not the kind Europe had known. He gave him something newer, stranger, uniquely American. A monument not just to ambition, but to the labor, the conflict, and the genius it took to make fantasy into fact. Biltmore may have been imagined by a Vanderbilt and drawn by an architect, but it was built by hands, calloused, sun-darkened, and in many cases, broken. From 1889 to 1895, over 1,000 workers came together in the remote Blue Ridge Mountains to raise what would become the largest private residence in the United States. They came from all corners of the country, and even across the Atlantic, drawn by the promise of steady wages and the allure of steady work in a time when employment was anything but secure. But the job was brutal, and for some, it was fatal. Official records don't exist, or were never kept, about how many men died building Biltmore. The company never maintained a memorial, and in an era without safety regulations or worker protections, workplace fatalities were often treated as unfortunate inevitabilities, not tragedies requiring recognition. Still, historians who study Gilded Age construction sites estimate that at least 15 men died during the 6 years it took to complete George Vanderbilt's dream. Their names were not engraved in stone, their faces never recorded in portraits, but their fingerprints are everywhere in Biltmore's foundations. Much of the labor was grueling physical work. Limestone blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were hoisted into place using pulley systems and human strength. Steel beams, revolutionary for a private home, were lifted without the cranes and harnesses we take for granted today. Workers scrambled over wooden scaffolding 70 feet above the ground, carving intricate friezes or hammering support brackets into place. The safety equipment was rudimentary to non-existent. No helmets, no railings, no fall protection. If you slipped, you fell. If you were crushed under stone or steel, your shift ended with a burial. Even the tools themselves were dangerous. Steam-powered cranes hissed and groaned, operated by men who understood the risks but needed the pay. Mechanical failures could scald, crush, or explode. Dynamite was used to blast through rock for the foundation, and mishandling it could, and did, prove fatal. Summers brought sweltering heat, causing dehydration, heat stroke, and collapse. Winters were bitter and cruel, but the work rarely stopped. Frozen hands swung hammers. Cold steel tore into exposed skin. A Vanderbilt's deadline waited for no season. George did what few of his peers did. He built housing for the workers. Brick Village, a collection of modest red brick homes, offered better living conditions than most laborers had ever known. He hired a doctor and nurses to staff an on-site hospital and provide treatment for the injuries that piled up daily. By Gilded Age standards, it was humane, even generous. But a hospital, no matter how well run, cannot cure the loss of a man crushed beneath a collapsing scaffold. It can only dress the wounds of survival. Among the most vulnerable were the European artisans George had imported to add refinement to his rustic kingdom. Italian stonecutters, Spanish tile workers, French plasterers. They arrived with skills passed down through generations, often unable to speak English, and far from the families they'd left behind. They carved mantels, frescoes, cornices, and staircases. They signed their work in hidden initials, tiny symbols etched into corners of ceilings or beneath banisters, private claims to public beauty. Some of those signatures remain. Some of the men who made them did not. When one of these craftsmen fell to his death or was mangled by machinery, there were no investigations. There were no lawsuits. There was no press coverage. The family, if they could be reached at all, might receive their final week's wages, enough to cover a coffin and burial in the Appalachian clay. Graves were often dug nearby, sometimes even on the estate grounds. Over time, they were forgotten, lost among the trees, beneath trails now walked by tourists. A few scattered stones remain, nameless, surrounded by wildflowers and silence, ghosts beneath the grandeur. The disparity between George's world and theirs was staggering. While he pored over books in his grand library and refined menus for his future guests, men bled into the dirt to support the marble above, while George worked late into the night discussing fireproofing and architecture with his advisors. Another worker might have been carried out on a stretcher, his limbs shattered, his body barely intact. The estate consumed lives in the pursuit of elegance. Beauty was not grown gently here. It was mined, stacked, nailed, carved, and in some cases, paid for in blood. There is a quiet cruelty in how these deaths are absent from the narrative Biltmore tells today. The official story celebrates George's vision, Hunt's designs, and Edith's determination, but it skips the scaffolding. It skips the pain. There is no exhibit for the laborer who fell installing the copper roof. No tour stops at the foundation where a man was buried alive in a cave-in. No plaque marks the hospital built because so many were injured that one was necessary. There is dignity in the craftsmanship, but silence in the sacrifice. The men who built Biltmore didn't just shape a house. They shaped a legacy. The towering spires, the sweeping halls, the carved archways. None of it exists without them. Their labor, their skill, and their pain made it possible. And though they died nameless to history, their work endures. Walk Biltmore's halls, and you are walking on their bones. Look at the limestone facade, and you are seeing the result of years of sweat and risk. Peer into the ornate ceilings, and you are staring into the dreams of men who never got to bring their own families here. Today, workplace safety is a matter of law. We take for granted hard hats, scaffolding standards, workers' compensation. But in George's time, safety was a suggestion, not an obligation. The Biltmore workers risked their lives to construct what most people today see only as luxury. It was beautiful. It still is. But that beauty, like all true beauty, came at a cost. And that cost, measured in lives lost and families left grieving, remains unpaid and mostly unremembered. As visitors file through the great house, they marvel at its grandeur. But perhaps, just for a moment, they should also pause. Not for George, not for Edith, but for the nameless builders whose bodies carried stone, whose hands crafted elegance, and whose lives gave shape to the dream. They built Biltmore, and Biltmore buried them. December 24th, 1895. After 6 years of construction, hundreds of workers, and millions of dollars, George Vanderbilt's dream was ready to be unveiled. The house stood gleaming in the crisp mountain air, its limestone facade catching the low winter sun, its turrets towering over the forest like watchful sentinels. This was not merely a house. It was a monument to taste, to vision, to wealth wielded with a scholar's hand. That Christmas Eve, George welcomed close family and esteemed friends into the grand halls of Biltmore for its opening. He had imagined this moment for years. It would be flawless. Except it wasn't. The problems began before the guests had even settled into their rooms. The heating system, designed to circulate steam through hundreds of feet of piping, began to fail. Pipes hissed and clanked in the walls. In some rooms, steam never arrived. In others, it arrived too forcefully, creating sweltering chambers that left guests sweating in formal wear. In at least 2 wings, pipes burst. Steam filled the corridors, causing servants to evacuate rooms and scramble for solutions. Elsewhere, radiators remained cold, leaving even George's mother, Maria, wrapped in furs inside her bedroom, visibly shivering. As the temperature dropped, so did the morale of the household staff. Many had been hired just weeks before, rushed through training, and now found themselves lost in a 250-room labyrinth with no margin for error. Hot and cold running water, the pride of the estate's modern plumbing system, behaved like a misfiring orchestra. Some bathrooms had no water at all. Others flooded. At one point, water poured through the ceiling of a second-floor hallway, damaging ornate plasterwork that had taken months to complete. Engineers scrambled behind the walls, tightening valves and patching leaks as quickly as they sprang. Meanwhile, the electric lights flickered in protest. Though Biltmore had its own power plant, a cutting-edge concept, the wiring was incomplete in parts of the house. Some guests ate dinner by candlelight, not for ambiance, but out of necessity. Circuits overloaded, sparks jumped, and the worst-case scenario, a fire in a supposedly fireproof house, almost became reality in a servant's corridor, where faulty wiring blackened a section of paneling. The estate's fire suppression system worked as designed, preventing disaster, but the message was clear. The house was not yet ready. In the dining rooms, the stress showed most clearly. George had envisioned a Christmas feast for the ages, multiple courses, each paired with carefully selected wines from the estate's cellars, prepared in modern kitchens outfitted with gas stoves, refrigeration, and state-of-the-art tools. But the staff didn't know the systems. The stoves fluctuated in temperature. The refrigeration lagged. Dishes were mistimed. Cold courses came hot. Hot courses arrived late. Servants stumbled between rooms, confused about where to deliver trays. One guest received soup intended for another table. Another found her dessert served before the main course. Then came the wine debacle. Somewhere in the rush, the cellar labels had been confused. Bottles of Bordeaux intended for the main course were served with the fish, while table wine, barely worth a mention, was poured for the roast. George, seated at the head of the banquet table beneath the massive Flemish tapestries, could see his guests' polite confusion. They were too well-mannered to complain, but their glances told the story. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was also chaos wrapped in stone. In the background, one person moved with quiet command: Edith Dresser. George's guest, and soon-to-be his wife, watched the unfolding crisis with composed eyes. She was no stranger to estates or staff. She had been raised in the rhythms of grand homes and understood that the key to elegance was not excess, but order. While George panicked behind a smile, Edith moved through the kitchens and corridors, organizing staff, calming tempers, and rerouting dishes. She gave instructions with clarity, offered solutions with gentleness, and by the next morning, breakfast had returned to something resembling grace. But the damage to George's pride was deep. He had invested not only his money, but his soul into Biltmore. He had envisioned this moment as his great debut, the scholar made lord, the mansion a stage upon which refinement would shine. Instead, the evening revealed the one thing he had tried hardest to avoid: imperfection. That Christmas Eve became a private humiliation, a lesson in the dangers of demanding perfection on an artificial deadline. If George had waited until spring, if he had allowed time for final systems testing, for training, for polishing the estate's many moving parts, the night might have gone differently. But he had wanted the symbolism of a Christmas opening. He had let romance dictate logistics. The result was unforgettable, but not in the way he'd hoped. In the months that followed, Biltmore gradually came into its own. The heating system was repaired. Electricians rewired key corridors. The kitchen staff was retrained. The servants learned the confusing geography of the house. What had been a disaster evolved into daily function. By spring of 1896, the mansion was what George had dreamed it would be. But that first night remained burned into memory. Proof that even a fortune like his could not tame time or technology without patience and humility. The story is rarely told on Biltmore tours. The official version jumps from construction to operation, as if the house moved seamlessly from concept to triumph. But the truth of that first Christmas makes the story richer, more human. It reminds us that even the Gilded Age's most perfect fantasy was flawed at its start. And in those flaws, we see the real George, a man striving for something grand, stumbling, and learning, not from loss of money, but from the shattering of illusion. By 1898, Biltmore had settled into its rhythm. The pipes ran warm. The lights flickered less. The menus were executed with precision. From the outside, it appeared that George Vanderbilt's dream had finally reached equilibrium. Guests continued to visit. Edith, now George's wife, had brought order and subtle authority to the vast household. But beneath the surface of perfect dinners and polished floors, unrest was building. Not from the walls, from the people who made those walls shine. 80 servants worked full-time to keep Biltmore running, and they were reaching a breaking point. The staff was a small army of housemaids, footmen, kitchen workers, laundresses, gardeners, and valets. Beneath the pristine silence of Biltmore's halls was a humming, invisible world of labor that never truly stopped. 12-hour days, 6 days a week, were standard. Sundays were supposed to include a half-day off, but that promise often disappeared the moment guests arrived or events were scheduled. Some servants worked from dawn until midnight, then rose again before sunrise to prepare the house for another day of aristocratic comfort. And yet, despite the grandeur they sustained, most earned a pittance, $10 to $15 per month, plus room and board. Life in the servants' quarters was a world apart from the opulence upstairs. While the grand bedrooms boasted imported linens, the maids slept in cramped, sparsely heated rooms. Some were tucked beneath staircases or above the kitchen, where heat and noise never stopped. The upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the chef, enjoyed slightly better accommodations and higher wages. But for the rank and file, life was exhausting, and dignity scarce. To make matters worse, they were charged for breakages. If a dish slipped from a maid's hand, or a broom snapped under strain, the cost was deducted from their already paltry wages. There was no appeal, no arbitration. Into this rising tension stepped a maid named Margaret. Her last name has been lost to history, but her legacy remains in whispers and the nervous memories of an event that nearly brought the Biltmore estate to a standstill. Margaret had worked in other great homes, including some in New York. She knew that servants had more power than they realized, if they acted together. Alone, a single footman could be fired and forgotten. But collectively, the entire staff could threaten the one thing Biltmore could not function without: labor. In hushed corners of the laundry room and whispers behind the scullery, Margaret began organizing. Her demands were measured. No revolt, no shouting in corridors. Just simple requests. That time off be honored, that dangerously cold rooms be improved, and that servants not be punished financially for accidents. She spoke with cooks, chambermaids, stable hands. She avoided the upper servants, knowing they were too loyal to management to risk solidarity. Within weeks, nearly 24 servants had quietly agreed. If changes weren't made, they would walk. The formal request arrived in March 1898, a neatly written letter delivered not to George, but to the head butler, listing grievances and requesting a meeting. The butler was furious. He dismissed the letter outright and warned the servants to remember their place. Margaret was threatened with dismissal. That's when the group escalated. A second letter was sent, this time directly to George. It stated that unless conditions improved, at least 20 staff members would resign. Not next month. Now. George was blindsided. He'd believed he treated his servants generously. He paid above-average wages by regional standards. He offered housing, meals, and even access to estate medical care. What more could they want? But George had always viewed his estate through the lens of hierarchy. He didn't understand that dignity isn't relative. His workers weren't comparing Biltmore to coal mines. They were comparing their treatment to the promises made when they were hired. Promises that were being broken. George turned to Edith, who once again became the voice of reason and quiet strength in the crisis. She understood how a house functioned, how the morale of the staff was as important as the structure of the walls. She advised a meeting, not with the entire group, but with a few representatives chosen for their thoughtfulness, not aggression, and she insisted that changes be made, not out of charity, but necessity. A house that size couldn't be run with unhappy staff. And word traveled quickly through servant networks. A mass resignation at Biltmore would stain the estate's reputation among domestic workers from New York to Charleston. George met the representatives in the library, surrounded by his thousands of rare books. They sat nervously on polished chairs while he listened. They were respectful, but firm. They did not demand a raise. They asked only that the original terms of their employment be honored. Time off when promised, heat in their rooms, fairness when accidents happened. It wasn't mutiny. It was a request for decency. George, to his credit, listened. And then he acted. Heating systems were extended to the worst rooms. The policy of docking wages for accidents was repealed, unless gross negligence could be proven. And, most significantly, the Sunday half-day off was reaffirmed and enforced unless overridden by specific emergencies. George made it clear, any supervisor who ignored this policy would face consequences. Margaret, despite her role as the quiet leader, was not fired. Though some senior staff wanted her gone, Edith intervened. Silencing the voice that saved the house would be both unjust and foolish. The crisis passed without drama. The servants stayed. Some, like Margaret, left within a few years to pursue marriage or other work. But the message remained. At Biltmore, even the lowest worker had the power to speak and to be heard. Quietly, without headlines or strikes, one of the first acts of labor resistance in a grand Gilded Age estate had taken place. It was not a revolution, but it was a reckoning. What this moment revealed about George is complex. He was not a tyrant. He was not cruel, but he was blind to the realities beneath his own vision. He saw the estate as a masterpiece of land, art, and architecture. Edith saw it as a living system of people, schedules, duties, and expectations. Without her, George might have dismissed the letter, fired half the staff, and created a public scandal. With her, he averted a crisis and gained loyalty. Today, Biltmore's narrative emphasizes innovation and grandeur. It speaks of the tapestries, the gardens, the architecture. But beneath all that, there was always a machine made of people. People who woke before dawn, scrubbed and polished, lifted and hauled, baked and served. And in 1898, those people reminded the house that without them, perfection was impossible. In October 1902, the crisp fall air at Biltmore carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and expectation. George Vanderbilt had invited 12 men, bankers, industrialists, old family friends, for a traditional hunting weekend on his sprawling estate. It was supposed to be the perfect retreat. Biltmore had been modeled, in part, after European country homes where aristocrats hunted game and cemented social bonds under the canopy of noble sport. George, though a quiet scholar, understood the power of ritual, and nothing bridged old money and new ambition like a well-hosted hunt. But this time, what began as recreation ended in blood. The group set out early on the second morning, rifles slung across shoulders, dogs in tow, estate guides flanking either side to track the game. The woods around Biltmore, dense, hilly, and vast, offered deer, wild turkey, and even black bear. For hours, the men dispersed into the woods, stalking through the underbrush. James Patterson, a pseudonym used by the press, was a New York financier, not an experienced hunter. Separated from the group, Patterson thought he had wounded a deer and followed a rustle in the trees. In a fatal twist, Another hunter nearby heard the same rustle and fired. The bullet struck Patterson in the abdomen. His scream cut through the forest. The hunting party abandoned their pursuits and ran toward the sound. What they found was a man bleeding, groaning, his coat soaked red, the ground beneath him pooling with his life. They were miles from the estate hospital. There were no cars, no radios. Patterson was lifted onto a makeshift stretcher fashioned from coats and tree limbs and carried over uneven ground by men more used to mahogany boardrooms than triage. By the time they reached help, hours had passed. Infection had already set in. The estate doctor performed emergency surgery with the tools and knowledge of the time. No antibiotics, no blood transfusion, just gauze, grit, and prayer. Patterson lingered for 6 days in a private room within the estate hospital, his groans echoing down sterile halls. Despite every effort, the infection worsened. On the 7th day, he died. George Vanderbilt was shaken to his core. This was not the accident of a stranger on a stranger's land. This was a guest, his guest, the kind of man George had built Biltmore to host. And he had died not from illness or misadventure, but from the activities George had arranged. The guilt was real, but the legal consequences were worse. Weeks later, the Patterson family filed a wrongful death lawsuit seeking $500,000, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to well over $15 million today. Their argument was clear. Biltmore's hunting operations were poorly supervised. There were no marked zones, no safety gear, not even colored clothing to distinguish men from animals. Alcohol had been served the night before. The estate had operated like an aristocratic playground, not a managed recreational facility. The implication was bold. George Vanderbilt, through his negligence, was responsible for a man's death. George's attorneys moved swiftly, framing the event as a tragic accident. The estate had employed guides, they argued. Patterson had separated from the group on his own, against instructions. The shooter, whose name was never released, had mistaken movement in the brush for an animal. There was no intent, no malice, just misfortune. And, crucially, hunting was inherently dangerous. Participants accepted that risk. But the Pattersons weren't just arguing about danger. They were arguing about accountability. The case dragged on for nearly 18 months. It became the subject of quiet discussion in drawing rooms and private clubs across the East Coast. If George lost the case, it would set a dangerous precedent. Every estate owner in America would suddenly face liability for every horsefall, every swim, every ride through the woods. The aristocratic veil of immunity was under threat from the distinctly American notion of legal equality. George could build a castle, but he couldn't build a law that protected him from the consequences of modern liability. During this time, all hunting on the Biltmore estate ceased. The gunroom, filled with polished walnut cases and rows of rifles like museum pieces, went silent. The dogs were kenneled, the guides dismissed. The traditions George had hoped would bind his social circle to his estate were frozen in place. The guests still came, but their pursuits turned tamer. Garden tours, reading salons, tea in the winter garden. Biltmore was becoming less a retreat and more a retreat from risk. Eventually, the case was settled out of court. The exact terms were sealed, but historical records and family accounts suggest George paid around $200,000 to the Patterson family, along with a legally binding clause that denied admission of guilt. It was a fortune, but not a loss in court. More importantly, it avoided setting a public precedent. The estate's lawyers had contained the damage. But George had learned a sobering lesson. In America, even a Vanderbilt could be sued. From that point forward, the estate changed. Guides were increased. Activities were closely supervised. Liability waivers became standard, even if their legal strength was dubious. Insurance costs climbed, and with them, a deepening realization. Biltmore was not the private paradise George had imagined. It was a legal organism, vulnerable at every edge. He had built his dream in the image of European nobility, but American law made no such distinctions. The death of James Patterson never appeared in Biltmore brochures. His name was buried with him, far from the estate, in a New York cemetery. But his shadow lingered. It passed through the gunroom, where the rifles were no longer touched. It echoed in the hunting trails, now overgrown with time. And it rested in George's private thoughts, a reminder that even in this haven of elegance, the real world, with its rules and its risks, still found a way in. That single accident shifted the trajectory of Biltmore's future. It marked the end of its attempt to function as an American version of a British country estate. The aristocratic fantasy gave way to managerial caution. George could preserve the art, the architecture, and the illusion, but not the social contract that allowed dukes and lords to host danger without consequence. In the United States, dreams could be sued. Patterson's death was not a scandal that consumed headlines. It was a quiet tragedy. But for Biltmore, it was a turning point. A moment when the estate's image cracked under the weight of real consequence. A man had died in pursuit of a vision, not unlike the workers who died building the estate, not unlike the families displaced before it. But this time, the cost wasn't hidden in the foundation. It was felt in the pocketbook and in George's soul. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt died in Washington, D.C., during what was supposed to be a routine surgery. He was just 51 years old. The official cause: complications from an emergency appendectomy. In an era when anesthesia was still an evolving science and antibiotics didn't exist, any operation could turn fatal. But the timing of George's death and the secrecy that surrounded it invited more than grief. It invited suspicion. George had traveled to the capital for meetings related to Biltmore's increasingly strained finances. The estate was bleeding money, too large, too complex, too dependent on a model of aristocratic living that no longer aligned with the economy of modern America. He had been meeting with financial advisors and government officials. Letters from the time suggest he was exploring options: land sales, perhaps tax strategies, maybe even converting parts of the estate into income-generating ventures. But in those final days, George began to feel a deep abdominal pain. He pushed through it, attending meetings and postponing rest. Only when the pain became unbearable did he seek medical help. The diagnosis: acute appendicitis. Immediate surgery was required. Even in 1914, an appendectomy was no longer considered an inherently fatal procedure. It had been performed thousands of times. But George's condition worsened rapidly once the operation began. His blood pressure dropped. His heart, always fragile, faltered under anesthesia. Within hours, he was gone. Edith was informed by telegram. Cornelia, their 13-year-old daughter, was at school. Biltmore fell into silence. The man who had conceived it, built it, and struggled to maintain it, had died far from its limestone walls, leaving behind not just grief, but uncertainty. The official narrative: while medically plausible, left gaps. Why had George ignored his pain for so long, especially given his wealth and access to care? What were those meetings in Washington about, and why the sudden urgency? Why did no detailed medical records survive? In truth, the absence of clear answers in a family known for careful planning only stirred more speculation. Some believed George's financial worries were worse than publicly known. He had been depleting his inheritance for years to keep Biltmore afloat. Perhaps he'd been considering a sale. Perhaps the pressure was breaking him down, both physically and emotionally. Others whispered of conspiracy. The theory, whispered in corridors and over brandy glasses, suggested that George's death was too convenient, that someone, perhaps a business rival, perhaps someone closer, had something to gain from his sudden demise. Some pointed to the timing. Europe was on the brink of war. Vanderbilt family investments spanned continents. The suggestion was that George knew too much, or was moving money in ways that threatened powerful interests. It was all speculation, of course. Nothing was proven. No smoking gun. Just shadows. The most persistent theory, though, was one of quiet, negligent malpractice. A miscalculation in anesthesia. A surgical error. Something avoidable, hidden by the silence of a private clinic and a family too shattered or too discreet to press for answers. The hospital notes from the procedure were never released. Whether they were destroyed, misplaced, or never created remains unknown. And without them, all that remains is conjecture and a lingering sense that George's end came not just unexpectedly, but strangely. Edith did not entertain conspiracy. At least, not publicly. She poured her focus into survival. George's death triggered a cascade of legal and financial complications. Estate taxes were looming. The estate, while grand, was cash poor. Much of the land was still undeveloped forest. The furnishings, art, and books had immense value, but not easily liquefiable without irreparably damaging George's vision. Edith had inherited a dream, and its full weight. She would have to defend it without him. Emotionally. George's death marked the end of Biltmore's golden age. He had lived in the house for only about 16 years, less time than it took to design and build it. In many ways, he had spent his life creating something that would outlive him, but he never got to see it fully realized as a stable legacy. His daughter was still a child. His finances were in question. The house itself, though majestic, was no longer sustainable under the original model of private aristocratic living. The deeper tragedy of George's death was that it exposed the flaw in his vision. He had wanted to transplant the grandeur and permanence of European aristocracy into the soil of democratic America. But America had no peerage, no state-funded palaces, no legal protection for legacy. When George died, he did so as a private citizen, not a duke. And as such, everything he owned was vulnerable, subject to taxation, to litigation, to the unrelenting demands of modern economics. In the years that followed, George's death would be remembered quietly, mourned deeply, but seldom questioned aloud. To challenge the official story would have required Edith to divert her focus from saving the estate, and she had no room for indulgent doubt. Her fight would be legal, logistical, and relentless. What mattered was not why George had died, but what she would do now that he had. Yet even today, for those who study the history of the estate, the questions linger. Was it simply a tragic medical event? Was it the consequence of overwork, financial pressure, and physical neglect? Or was there something darker behind the silence? The absence of clear answers means that George Vanderbilt's final chapter remains partially unreadable, an unfinished sentence at the end of a life defined by control and careful composition. Biltmore stood after George's death, but it stood differently. The light that had guided its creation was gone. What remained was a house filled with shadows, managed not by its dreamer, but by those left behind to salvage what they could. The conspiracy theories may never be proven, but perhaps they exist not because of malice, but because of grief. Because people struggled to believe that a life so grand, so carefully built, could end so suddenly, so quietly, and leave behind so many unspoken questions. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, Edith was left with a grieving daughter, a sprawling estate, and a treasury bleeding faster than she could stop it. She had lost her husband unexpectedly, and now the federal government was knocking with ledgers and demands. The initial estate tax was projected to be manageable, around $150,000, a painful but surmountable sum. But war was coming, and the government's appetite would grow sharper and more merciless. In the years that followed, World War I consumed the nation's attention and its coffers. To fund the escalating costs of war, Congress passed sweeping tax reforms. By 1916, estate tax rates had soared. By 1918, the top bracket was 25%. The IRS, now an increasingly aggressive agency with new authority, came back to Edith not with a revision, but with a recalculation. They declared that George's estate, including Biltmore, was worth $15 million, and under the new wartime rates, Edith owed $3.7 million in taxes. It was a staggering number, and it came with a threat: pay, or the government would begin seizing assets. Edith was no fragile society widow. She had managed Biltmore behind the scenes long before George's death. But now, she stood alone against the most powerful institution in the country. She could have folded. Many women in her position would have sold the house, auctioned the land, retreated from the fight. But Edith wasn't defending wealth for its own sake. She was defending George's vision, her daughter's inheritance, and the idea that Biltmore could survive its creator. She hired the best tax attorneys in New York. They prepared for war. The argument was both financial and philosophical. How do you place a market value on something as singular as Biltmore? Yes, it had cost over $6 million to build. But construction costs do not equate to resale value. Who would buy a 250-room chateau in rural North Carolina? Who could afford to operate it? The estate was a monument, not a market commodity. It was beautiful, yes, but unsellable. The IRS countered coldly. Value was value. The art collection alone was worth millions, they argued. The furnishings, the land, the antiques, all could be sold. And if Edith wouldn't sell them, the government would. Their position was clear. Biltmore wasn't just a home. It was a tax asset, and they intended to extract their share. For 5 years, the battle dragged through hearings, courtrooms, and backdoor negotiations. Edith sold off land, 86,000 acres, to the federal government, helping form what would become Pisgah National Forest. It raised $500,000, but it wasn't enough. She reduced staff, closed wings of the house, auctioned pieces of furniture from unused rooms, and began mortgaging parts of the estate. And still, the IRS pressed on. Every delay cost more in legal fees. Every appraisal, every witness, was another line item in a growing column of debt. The most brilliant move came in 1922. Edith, exhausted but defiant, threatened to donate Biltmore to the federal government. All of it. House, contents, land. A total donation would void the tax burden under the law, grant her a massive charitable deduction, and turn the estate into a public holding. It would be poetic justice and a tactical nightmare for the IRS. The government did not want a 250-room chateau. It would cost millions to maintain. It would yield no tax revenue. And if Edith followed through, they'd lose the entire assessment. The bluff was brilliant. The IRS blinked. In 1923, they agreed to a settlement, $1.1 million. Still astronomical, but a third of the original demand. Edith paid it through a painful combination of sales, loans, and personal sacrifice. By 1925, the debt was cleared, but the estate was changed. The art collection George had so lovingly assembled was thinner. The land he'd once walked, imagining forests restored, was now in public hands. Entire wings of Biltmore were shuttered to save on heating and maintenance. The staff, once a bustling network of maids, cooks, and footmen, had been reduced to its skeletal core. But Edith had done what few could. She had held the line. She had kept Biltmore intact, diminished, yes, but alive. More importantly, she had rewritten its future in defending the estate. She realized that the original model, a private residence supported by inheritance, was dead. The house had to earn its own way now. And so she began exploring ideas that would have horrified the original George, opening the estate to the public. That idea, radical at the time, was born not out of vanity, but necessity. If the estate was to survive the next generation, it had to become more than a home. It had to become a business. Tourism, events, public access, all concepts foreign to the Gilded Age mindset, became part of the new strategy. But that shift began not in the drawing room, but in the courtroom. It began with the IRS and a widow who refused to be broken. In hindsight, Edith's battle with the IRS wasn't just about taxes. It was about value, how we measure it, who defines it, and what we're willing to sacrifice to preserve it. The government saw Biltmore as a luxury asset. Edith saw it as a legacy. And in the end, her vision won, barely. The estate she defended with pen and prayer became the seed of a family business that still survives today. It was not the future George imagined, but it was a future. And it was one she had fought for with everything she had. Today, tourists marvel at the house. They admire the landscape. They sip wine in the tasting room and marvel at the view from the terrace. But none of that would be possible if Edith had faltered. The estate that stands today is not just a monument to wealth. It is a monument to endurance, a testament to the will of a woman who faced the IRS, the courts, and the crumbling foundations of her world, and refused to let them take what mattered most. Stand at the gates of Biltmore today, and what you'll see is an American marvel. A grand chateau flanked by manicured gardens, rolling forests, and a still operational vineyard. You'll be welcomed with hospitality, immersed in history, and offered wine, postcards, and reservations at one of several estate restaurants. You'll pay between $75 and $95 for admission. At a glance, it seems like the estate must be thriving. But beneath the polished veneer is a reality most visitors never consider. Biltmore isn't just a home. It's a complex, high-stakes financial ecosystem, a legacy surviving on strategy, scale, and an endless stream of revenue. The Biltmore Company doesn't publicly share detailed financial statements. It is privately owned, operated by descendants of George Vanderbilt, but with tax records, industry comparisons, and infrastructure disclosures, we can piece together the machinery that keeps this titan standing. First, the property itself, 8,000 acres of maintained land, plus a 250-room mansion filled with priceless artwork, antique furniture, and original books. Property taxes alone cost over $5 million per year. That's before a single guest walks through the front door or a single chandelier is dusted. Maintaining the house requires a small army of specialized staff, electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, groundskeepers, art preservationists, structural engineers, all trained in historic maintenance. Roughly 250 employees are directly tied to upkeep. With average salaries and benefits, that equals over $12 million annually. Then come the tourism operations. Biltmore welcomes over 1 million visitors a year, guiding them, feeding them, accommodating them, and ensuring their satisfaction takes another 500 workers. When you account for retail employees, winery staff, hotel workers, security, and event planners, you're looking at around 750 to 1,000 employees across the estate. Labor costs, conservatively estimated, total at least $35–40 million a year. Add in utilities, heating, cooling, lighting, plumbing, for a structure built before insulation was standard. Factor in $1 million annually in energy bills. Add insurance costs, which soar due to the priceless and irreplaceable items within the house. Paintings, tapestries, antique woodwork, books bound in leather centuries ago. That's another $3 to $5 million per year just to ensure the building and its contents against disaster. And still, we haven't touched the ongoing maintenance and restoration. Every year, something at Biltmore needs serious repair. Stone restoration, roof sealing, floor refinishing, plaster preservation, textile cleaning, painting stabilization, pest control. None of it is cheap. Biltmore is not just an old house, it's a living museum. Historic preservation doesn't allow for shortcuts or modern substitutes. If a stone balustrade begins to crack, the replacement must be hand-carved from matching limestone. If a tapestry fades, it must be treated by textile conservators trained in European restoration techniques. These costs average around $5 to $10 million per year, and some years, when the roof needs attention or a major gallery is restored, those figures balloon higher. Despite this, Biltmore makes money. Admissions bring in around $65 million annually. The on-site winery generates $20 million. The Inn and Village Hotel pull in another $15 to $18 million. Restaurants, shops, event rentals, particularly weddings and holiday events, bring in another $20 million. In total, the estate generates about $120 million annually. But once all costs are subtracted, labor, operations, restoration, legal, taxes, the real profit margin is narrower than it seems. Yes, Biltmore survives, but it doesn't coast. It hustles. Every new offering, the wine club, the hotel expansion, the retail additions, is part of a larger survival strategy. Biltmore must innovate constantly. Tourism alone isn't enough to cover unpredictable preservation demands. This is not a passive legacy. It is an active business. If admissions drop by just 10% in a given year, due to economic downturn or global events. It creates a ripple effect that reaches every corner of the estate. Layoffs, postponed repairs, cutbacks in conservation all become real risks. There is also the question of succession. Estate taxes have not gone away. Every generation must transfer control without triggering catastrophic inheritance penalties. The current owners are employing complex estate planning tools, conservation easements, charitable trusts, limited partnerships, and strategic gifting, all designed to keep Biltmore in family hands without being torn apart by the IRS. These strategies aren't cheap. Legal and accounting costs for this kind of estate planning can run into the millions annually, and it must be planned decades in advance. The family who owns Biltmore lives with contradiction. They are stewards of something that must look effortless while requiring endless labor. They cannot sell the house. It is too unique, too protected, and would collapse under new ownership. They cannot walk away. It would rot without constant care. The mansion gives them status, history, purpose, but it also limits their freedom. They don't own a house. The house owns them. Compared to other Gilded Age homes, Biltmore is a statistical anomaly. The Breakers in Newport is owned by a preservation society. The massive Vanderbilt homes in Manhattan were demolished. Rosecliff, Whitehall, and many others are museums, often supported by grants and donors. Biltmore stands alone as a private, self-sustaining Gilded Age estate still in the hands of its original family. And that survival is not owed to luck. It is owed to calculation, sacrifice, and commercial ingenuity. Many visitors see their admission ticket as steep, but in truth, it's discounted. The real cost of maintaining Biltmore exceeds what tickets could ever fully support. The wine you sip funds roof repairs. The gift shop pays for mold prevention. The hotel suites cover heating bills from the banquet hall to the library. It's all part of a massive, carefully orchestrated equation, an invisible dance between romance and revenue. In the end, what visitors experience is a fantasy. Timeless elegance, seamless hospitality, the illusion of effortlessness. What they do not see is the spreadsheet behind the staircase, the legal team behind the flower beds, the preservation specialist behind the velvet ropes. That's the real cost of Biltmore today, not just in dollars, but in vigilance. Every inch of luxury hides a ledger. Biltmore stands today as one of the most beautiful structures ever built on American soil. Tourists walk its halls in awe, camera shutters clicking beneath vaulted ceilings and over-polished marble. Its gardens spill down the mountain like a vision pulled from Versailles. The rooms are dressed in velvet, light streaming through stained glass, chandeliers catching gold in the air. But beneath that beauty lies a truth few care to confront. Biltmore was never just a mansion. It was a machine, powered by labor, fed by sacrifice, and preserved through loss. It is paradise built on human cost. The story begins with a fire, 3 servants dead in Newport. Their names were lost to history until recently, their deaths invisible fuel for a safety obsession that shaped the architecture of Biltmore. That tragedy didn't end with George's vow to build fireproof stone. It rippled outward, across mountain valleys, through displaced families who lived on land that was never empty. George bought 125,000 acres, piece by piece, quietly removing over 1,000 families who had lived there for generations. No shots were fired, no violence erupted, but the result was the same. People lost their homes, churches closed, schools shuttered, Cemeteries disappeared into forest. And then came the workers, the masons, carpenters, and laborers who risked their lives to raise limestone walls in a wilderness that barely had roads. Some of them fell. Some of them were crushed. Some died of infection, buried in graves no one marks or visits. There are no plaques, no flowers, only quiet. They built Biltmore, stone by stone, day by brutal day. And when they died, the work continued without them. That was the way of things. Beauty, in that time, required a certain body count. Even after the walls were raised, the house wasn't free. It demanded a staff the size of a regiment to maintain it. 80 servants during peak operation. They lived in heatless rooms, worked 12-hour days, and were docked pay for broken plates. When they rose in quiet protest in 1898, it wasn't for revolution. It was for rest. A maid named Margaret organized them. And when George listened, truly listened, it was Edith who helped him understand that beautiful homes required more than just materials. They required fairness, too. But Biltmore wasn't done extracting its toll. In 1902, a hunting guest was killed by a fellow guest. A lawsuit followed. $500,000 in damages sought. The case settled, but the damage lingered. George's dream of hosting European-style leisure vanished. There were no more hunts, no more rides without liability waivers. Even paradise had to bend to American law. The castle on the hill was still grand, but it was becoming a fortress against risk rather than a haven of pleasure. Then George died, abruptly, at 51. Officially, appendectomy complications. Unofficially, a storm of rumors, financial collapse, conspiracy, malpractice. The truth may never be known. What is known is this: his death nearly doomed Biltmore. Edith inherited not just a house, but a crisis. And when the IRS raised its axe, demanding millions in back taxes, she did not run. She fought. 5 years. Land sales. Furniture auctions. Strategic gambles. She outmaneuvered the federal government not with might, but with will. She saved the estate, but the cost was staggering. From that moment on, Biltmore ceased to be a private home in the old sense. It became something else: a business, a brand, a survival story. It opened its doors to strangers. It sold its wine. It hosted weddings and dinners and holiday light shows. Tourists came, and they still come. But what they see is the curated dream, the library, the banquet hall, the opulence untouched. What they don't see is the accounting department, the legal counsel, the marketing team. Biltmore is no longer simply a house. It is an enterprise engineered to hold back decay. The family still owns it. But ownership has changed. They are not residents in the traditional sense. They are custodians, inheriting not leisure, but responsibility. Each generation faces the same question: how do we keep this place alive without selling our souls, or the walls that hold our memories? And the answer, always, is sacrifice. George sacrificed his fortune. Edith sacrificed her peace. Their descendants sacrificed privacy. All for stone and dream. So what is Biltmore, really? It is not just a house. It is a reckoning, a reflection of the American contradiction. How beauty and brutality so often share the same foundation. The guests who admire the tapestries rarely think about the immigrant who hung them, 70 feet in the air, without a harness, The visitors who pose by the gardens rarely know that those hills once held cabins, now vanished. And those who sip wine in the conservatory rarely imagine Edith, sitting alone in the library, pen in hand, fighting off federal seizure. The wonder of Biltmore is not that it exists, it is that it survived. Through death, through scandal, through lawsuits, taxes, wars, and changing values, it still stands. But to walk through its halls without understanding its cost is to walk blind. The walls may not speak, but they remember. And every carved stone, every burnished floorboard, every shadowed corridor whispers the same truth. Nothing this grand comes free. Behind the fairy tale is a debt. Behind the beauty, a burden. Behind the paradise, a price paid in silence and sweat and suffering. And yet, perhaps that is what makes Biltmore most American. Not its luxury, but its endurance. Its survival is a story not of privilege alone, but of struggle, compromise, and the unrelenting belief that some dreams are worth the cost.